everyone else can see the questions, but not us.
Well, you have to crane your necks backwards. All right, first question, and it's very, lots of people voted for it. Are there any aquatic benefits from burning cattails? And if you three people can use this, well, that's probably a question for Dan mostly. If you think of it, if you hold it down here, that's a little better than holding it right there.
Okay.
Take a shot at that.
Bird benefits for burning cattails? Is that what? That's the question?
Benefits.
Aquatic benefits? Well, certainly for wetland birds, they like open water. And we have so many of these cattail dominated wetlands that are monotypes and need to open them up. You can do that with fire under the right conditions. Even some cases where conditions are pretty wet, you can get patchy burns of the cattails, and that's probably optimum. Any other comments? You burn a few cattails up in your area too, right, John? Just a few?
I call the cattail units cheater units because they get you a lot of acres for no effect. You burn cattails, you get cattails. So I know, especially in Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge and some others, maybe Jason could talk more on this, but some of the summer burning has been somewhat effective on reducing cattails. I'll say that burning cattails at 90 degrees is about the most miserable fire you can be on, but there is a good effect. So, but I don't know or how that might affect on anything that lives in the water. No idea.
Anyone out there want to add anything to that?
If you want muskrats, get rid of your cattails. You gotta get rid of that old rank cattails.
Turn that way off.
They don't like old rank cattails. They want those fresh shoots. So burning your cattails, keep the open water.
Does it have to be all
Maybe
the way
it was
off?
Is
Say
this
that
on
again,
now?
we'll repeat it for the mic. Is that all the way off?
Like powered completely
Yes.
off?
I don't know why, but.
Yes,
Yep,
it is.
okay.
One thing we're missing in our wetlands is muskrats right now. And muskrats don't like old rank cattails that have been out there for years. They want that burns it off, new growth coming in, and then they'll come in there and start removing all those cattails from their bedding and food, and allows you to get that more open, heavy marsh aspect.
Great, thanks, Jason.
Is this on?
Steiner, let us know if you're not hearing that very well when we go to the mic elsewhere in the room. Next question is for John. Would the use of drones be a more affordable option for aerial ignition?
No, at least not at the scale that we do things. Again, a helicopter becomes useful after about 1,000 acres. The drone models that I've seen so far hold about 24 balls. And for 1,000 acres, we would expect at least 500 to 800 balls being used. So the drones have only, half an hour flight time, so you need about, and they have to be operated within line of sight. So the maximum area a drone could be used on is about 200 acres, which for our burning is just useless. So to bring it to the scale that we want is helicopters required. Future, if we get into fixed wing drone technology, there might be a future in that, but as long as we're stuck with quadcopter drone technology, we're not going to go anywhere.
Great. There's a related question that hasn't gotten a lot of votes, but while you're at it, you mentioned the number of balls. What does it take to outfit a helicopter with an ignition system? How does that work?
It's just a machine about the size of this stool. Fits between the guy's legs, and they just bolt it to the side of a helicopter. And one guy has a great job of looking out of a helicopter all day. But it doesn't take much. I don't know how much it costs, but it doesn't take much of a helicopter, and it's not that much of a machine.
So you're dropping like ping pong ball sized
Yeah,
things and they ignite on impact?
Yeah, they're plastic ping pong balls. They're filled with potassium permanganate. The machine injects antifreeze in there, and the antifreeze potassium permanganate creates an exothermic reaction, which gets hot enough to light the plastic on fire. So at 70 degrees, in about 30 seconds, that plastic lights on fire. And if it doesn't land in water, it will get whatever leaves, grass. If it lands in water, it just makes funny noises.
Can you flip that one all the way off, please? And response from the audience?
Yeah, so as far as aerial ignition goes, we have a couple different machines. We've got the PSD machines, like you were talking about, that we can have it loaded up in a helicopter within an hour.
So this is PSD.
Torch, which is like a 55-gallon drip torch.
The bomb.
With it underneath. So there's a couple different tools that you can use depending on what you need and what kind of intensity you need to burn. So I actually just completed like a 10-year cost analysis for PSD, and I converted all the old costs into today's dollars. And like it was pointed out, bigger units are obviously going to be more cost effective. If you have a black line where we can come in and do a bunch in the day, units were going just shy of $3 an acre with the PSD machine. Helitorch is obviously a little bit more expensive, being that we're using premium gas mixed with a gelling agent. So that was around $8 to $10 an acre for the Helitorch.
Thank you. Next question. Without trees to record fire, is there any potential to use soil cores and charcoal layers to build fire chronology?
I assume so.
Go ahead.
Evan? I assume so. I mean, they've used charcoal in other wet systems.
I can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, let's just use this.
Yeah. It's flash.
DJ. So we just had a new paper come out from Cedar Creek where we matched charcoal that was sampled from Cedar Bog Lake to tree rings, and it worked out pretty well. The issue with charcoal is that the resolution is really difficult to get at some of the really important metrics that I think a lot of us are thinking about and talking about. So you could say definitely, was there more fire or less fire during various time periods? And under certain situations, you can get really high resolution from charcoal, but in most cases, you're talking about decades to centuries. And in soil, there's a lot of bioturbidity issues that come into play. And so you can get a picture, but it's often not quite specific enough for a lot of the questions that people are wondering about.
Great, thank you, Evan. Next question is, could the difference in bird response be related to whether the birds were seed versus insect eaters?
That's a good question.
So many of you know that I am not a wildlife biologist by training. I had a wonderful grad student who did all the bird work on this project, and she explored some guild work more with habitat type guilds, thinking about the shrub versus sedge. And she had just started to get into looking at feeding guilds, and then she got a wonderful job working for the Rocky Mountain Bird Conservancy or something in the US-Mexico border region, and all of that work has slowed down a little bit in terms of that next step of from the thesis. So good question. And I think, sure, for me, like as a plant person, the fires and the seasonality is going to affect the seasonality of the vegetation and of the insects, so their phenology. So that phenology is going to change, and then that's going to influence and change resource availability. So I think, yeah, I think this is a great hypothesis, and we have not tested it yet.
Thanks, Rebecca. Another one for you.
I think I replied to this one
Oh,
and
did you?
several other ones. I have not received any information about the burns or the burn conditions from from my wildlife collaborators, like from the burn through the wildlife collaborators, and it's something I have asked for now, and I'm looking to compile, but I don't have that information right now. And I was talking to someone after the talk that makes it harder to interpret because I don't have the information on the conditions on most of those days. So, and somebody made a comment like they were on one of the burns, and I replied like, "Come talk to me, please." I'm trying to get the information so that I can incorporate that into the work.
Yeah, that's a good reason to use your name if you're willing to have someone follow up with you. For large burns, how are you providing for wildlife refugia, specifically for insects and slow recovering organisms?
Well, if you watch that video very closely, and I've got a lot of aerial photography now to show it. On our large burns, not all of it's going to burn. It provides refugia on its own. That 5,000 acre burn that we did again this spring, there was there were patches. You can see from aerial photos that there were patches distributed throughout that did not burn. But there was about one 800 acre large patch that did not burn as well. So that's a fire shadow that would provide significant refugia. So while I can't say that rule always happens, there was another 1,000 acre unit that burned completely. But these are all within the context of much larger landscape complexes. These are not isolated pieces. So they, things will migrate back in.
Any problems with peat fires, John, up in your country?
The question is whether or not I have any problems with peat fires. No, of course not. We don't have
He's
peat.
lying.
Yeah, no. Where we have, I can think of one fire one year where we had undisturbed peat catch fire. But for the most part, if we have peat catch fire, it is disturbed peat along roads or things like that that will burn in much different conditions. So typically our undisturbed peat is very resistant to fire.
Thanks, John. We got a little flurry of questions here for Rebecca. Any sense of how seasonality of burn impacts nesting phenology and ability of birds to re-nest following loss to fire?
Right, with the caveat that I'm a forest ecologist, the DNR wildlife bird colleagues, what I've learned from them is often there is bird mortality in spring burns, but the benefits long-term of those burns outweigh the bird losses in that particular season. I've also been told that they have seen birds re-nesting after fires, and so re-nesting does happen. I gave a version of this talk at the research review, and I know some of you have seen it now twice. And I asked someone afterwards, like, I'd love to have someone, do some nest searching and do some more intensive work in these systems. And they looked at me like I was nuts. anyway, like, good idea, but so much work that they weren't biting on that one.
Yeah, it really depends on the time of year. If you're burning in that late May window, you can pretty much count on nest mortality. And did you do a bunch of work on prairie chickens and nests and stuff? Or you might know more about that.
Right.
There's going to be some
Instead of us just
mortality.
Yeah, we've seen some good
shrubs.
prairie chicken mothers that wanted to stay on the nest as it burned over. If you're burning earlier or mid-spring, there's a very good chance of re-nesting. And especially for these grassland birds, if you're burning in that summer window, they're gone. That late August window, they're actually on their way to whatever southern climes they head to.
All right. I guess a couple more votes have come in, but Rebecca, let's stick with you. Two others I see here. Have you considered including Indigenous knowledge into the next steps of your research?
Yeah, this is a project, I didn't tell the story when I started, but when I did start this project, I was less involved with tribal natural resource work, and from over the last 5 years, my work has really evolved into actually going into new projects in a co-development kind of framework. And for most of the new work I've started doing, it's been sitting down and saying, what can we do together? And that's changed in some ways a number of my projects. And so I would envision that to the extent that I may continue working in brushlands, that would be something I would be interested in doing and would want to be reaching out and consulting and engaging.
Great. Rebecca, how would you expect the veg and bird responses to change if brushlands were managed with mowing or shearing instead of fire?
Good question.
Do you want to address this?
If you have a guess, go ahead.
Well, I think
That's
some of
yes.
the seasonal effects, to the extent that buds aren't damaged, so if fires are low enough severity that you're not damaging some of the bud banks that affect the resprouting, then you're going to have similarities, I would think, between fire and shearing in terms of seasonal effects. I think when you start getting into impacts of fire that really alter the ecosystem in terms of both severity and mortality from temperature, as well as some of the ash inputs, then you're going to, I would expect that would lead to differences in the outcomes with shearing and mowing versus fire. And I'm going to pass it on to these guys to see what they have to say.
Mowing is going to be much patchier because you have wet spots. Whereas if you burn an area, you get a pretty complete burn. It's going to take off most of the cover, and you're going to have a greater amount of nest loss as compared to mowing. Because most of the brushland areas have a lot of wet spots.
You also need to think of what's the long-term effect. Some birds require some birds like a bobolink wants nearly no duff on an area, and something like a Henslow's sparrow wants a lot of duff. Mowing, shearing does not remove duff, it accumulates duff. So in the end, depends what you want. You're going to, you will have some structural differences, but it's that duff that will really affect some bird species. And on top of that, that mowing and shearing, especially in these brushlands, what you then incorporate into the duff is chopped up sticks. I don't think anyone's researched that, but when I've tried to just fluff that up, that's actually really, really difficult to move. I'm sure some birds will like it, some birds won't, but those chopped up sticks I imagine will have an effect.
Dan, this one might be for you first. Whoops, I clicked the wrong, someone must have voted for it before how does contemporary cattle grazing compare with historic bison effects on Parklands communities? You mentioned both cattle and bison in your talk.
Well, they both can be intensive. I think, in my experience, cattle would get into lower areas a little bit more than bison, again, just based on my experience. And they'll go into lower areas even more if the lower areas have been burned. Otherwise, they'll kind of avoid those. And I'm not sure how bison would compare in that regard. So any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is a real moving target in research because one of the assumptions, a lot of our current research on bison is due to, it's on fenced herds. I seem to remember a paper came out just recently that highlighted that assumption, and that may invalidate most of our research on bison. So in the end, we really don't know how bison grazed as a free roaming herd. And we can come up guesses. So there's some guesses that bison ate more grass, that some recent research is, ate more grass compared to cattle. Cattle would eat more forest, but that might not be true. That actually might be a fence effect. So we don't know, but there are differences, and I think the big difference is how wetlands are used. Bison go into a wetland to drink and then go out, and cattle will wallow.
Would you flip that one off, please, for a comment from the audience? Thank you.
So I can provide a Great Plains perspective on that question. A lot of the research out there, and I think it's fair to characterize the prevailing school of thought is it has much more to do with management than the actual which herd will work.
Mm-hmm.
And so a high intensity grazing scheme with either animal will give you very similar results. A low intensity, extensive landscape type of management approach with either animal will give you very similar results. There's especially how they both respond to fire.
Yep.
Fire that's applied passionately across a landscape, they both respond very similarly. And there's more overlap in diet breadth than there is differences. Yeah, they're both primarily granulators.
Yep.
Thank you. John, what sort of legal documents have you had to put in place to make the partnerships successful?
Thankfully, that's not my job. This is where the big team comes in, and you have lawyers that create MOUs. And the nice part about the fact that we have had long histories with TNC in the prairies doing fire have led to very robust MOUs that have expanded nationwide, really. So we now have a nationwide MOU with Fish and Wildlife Service regarding fire. So sometimes these small things add up to big things. We have a nationwide one with the Forest Service now. I think about the only agency, federal agency, that we don't have a nationwide MOU with now is BIA.
We're in the works on it.
And you're in the works. Okay, Andre's working on it. Woo! But yeah, those MOUs, especially in the young stages, are difficult and painful, but they're the only way to go. If you don't have one, you're not going to be burning together.
Okay. Rebecca, with the fire treatments, did reed canary grass populations become problematic? Maybe it's just still too soon after the fires, but can reed canary be controlled with deliberate season burning?
Yeah, we didn't have enough of it out there in our core areas to answer that question. I don't know if you two have pretty canary grass.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And we wish we could control it with fire, but no.
Loves fire.
All right. Do you need to create a second burn plan for those donut holes, especially if going back into burn day 1, you know your plan is to come back later?
I incorporate that into a single burn plan as a if-then scenario. What we do is we just have in our ignition section donut hole strategy paragraph to just say if we want to reignite this unit, because the first day is the same no matter what. The first day, whether or not we plan to burn the whole unit or just donut hole the unit, it's the same resources, same types of operations. Then we just add a paragraph. If we want to reignite the unit with aerial ignition, then we put out all the specifications there for how many resources we would need on that second day. And that's kind of still in the works. We've also taken the route of then we are required to make a whole nother IEP to cover that day. It is mentioned in the burn plans though, to at least as an if-then scenario, and I've seen it done multiple ways.
The next one Rebecca has already replied to, but it's anonymous and I wanted to bring it up so that person sees the reply. So note for the summer prescriptions, we experienced above average moisture, never received window more than a week without precip. Dry summer would be different results. So Rebecca said, that sounds like someone on the burn, but it was anonymous and she replied. So if that was you, you can raise your hand or maybe just come find her afterwards, right? You want to talk to that person?
Yeah.
She noted that she has not received, well, you said this to her, I haven't received the data from the fire team, so would love to talk to you. Okay, is there comparable success across the border into Canada, and are you sharing notes?
I work with Nature Conservancy Canada. I was born in Canada, so it's not bad for me to say. I think the Canadians are actually more than 20 years behind us in thought behind fire. I would say the predominant attitudes there are still along the lines of nature is something without people, and so adding a fire would be a human action, and therefore that's not natural. So Nature Conservancy Canada does do some fire. They have a limited capacity, but the state agencies, it's completely foreign to them. Or I should say provincial and federal agencies, it's foreign to them.
There was a comment made, I'm not going to really go through, but interesting comment. Bison population high with loss of indigenous hunters due to European disease, reducing hunter population. There's a link there that I looked at quickly to a research article that is interesting. So I just wanted to draw that to everyone's attention. We've got 12 seconds left. Thank you, Lucia. And I think we're going to call it there. So let's thank our panel for great questions. Really good. Okay, for now,